known anything. Title, it's very specific, talking about idea of what you're going to be. And you've given the link to the CFP, which is fantastic. You go into the table of contents. Before I talk about that, just really quickly to go over the National Geographic's CFP, or theirs is an RFP, it's the same thing. They're interested in something that, you know, is not surprising. They're looking at, they're saying the mandate of the IUCN Species Survival Commission is to stimulate, promote, and support conservation actions for halting biodiversity decline, preventing species extinction, and restoring conserving intact habitats and ecosystems both on the ground and in the water. So in partnership, so National Geographic has a partnership with this Species Survival Commission, and as well as this Fondation Secret, I don't know who they are. The goal of this request for proposal, or the CFP, is to halt further biodiversity decline by implementing these conservation plans for species and groups of species. So we support priorities as well as conservation actions endorsed by the relevant SSC Species Specialist Group. Currently, we are not supporting biodiversity assessments or conservation planning activities. So that's important, because that's what we're saying. This RFP is not looking for biodiversity assessments. They're asking for these things. Of course, you don't have to do them as part of your grant proposal. If you were actually doing this, you would, but you don't have to do it for this particular thing. So proposals should focus on the following themes, right? Specific and defensible priority actions to avert decline of a species or group of species, which is what your presentation is focusing on. You're focusing on the black-footed ferret, and you're focusing on actions to avert decline. The second bullet point there, projects that include the active involvement of early career conservationists. So this is National Geographic saying we would love for younger people who are starting out in the field to be involved in these types of projects, because they want to help foster careers where people will have careers in conservation, and also projects that support conservation leaders from the countries where the species or group of species occur. So you're focusing on that first bullet point there. You don't have to focus on all of them. Unfortunately, you don't got a lot of money to work with. So typical proposal request should be less than $30,000. That's not a lot of money. However, applicants may request up to $50,000, and successful applicants may use awarded funds over 1 or 2 years. This is very unfortunate on behalf of National Geographic, because I feel like they could afford more. But they have some info and budgetary guidance, and preference will be given to proposals that include feasible plans to demonstrate change in key quantifiable indicators of, for example, reduction in drivers of population decline, that is, or for example, unsustainable hunting, fishing, or logging, right, in the black-footed ferret population. You've established kind of what are the drivers of population decline. So, upside, great CFP, good cause. Downside, not a lot of money. So just to give you an example, this is your group 3, so you're the third one. For a third group I'm giving feedback to. The first group had $1 million. and the second group had 125,000, and you guys have 30,000. Although you may request up to 50,000 if you feel the need to ask for that extra $20,000, and over 1 or 2 years. So clearly, my initial thought, or my initial recommendation, and I recommended this for the group that had $125,000. I said, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have money to hire people. So your group really needs to pretend that you already work for whatever company you're focusing on, because you need to focus that money on the strategies for enacting your proposal rather than on hiring personnel. So, or else you're working with volunteers. So it's one of those things. So that's the CFP. So, and I just like to go over it again because how I go through these CFP or the presentation drafts is that I try to read as the National Geographic, right? Whoever is, I keep saying the National Geographic, there's no article there, as National Geographic. So I'll always go back to, well, what do they say? You know, is this aligned with what they want? So, table of contents, right? History of what? I would just be more specific there. Introduction, why isn't your intro first? And I feel like the intro should always be first, and then maybe give a little bit of history. Why what? Why the proposal? So more information. Problem, I feel like these two could be combined. The plan should be addressed in the introduction, and I would combine these two, and then I would have a more in-depth slide that's about the plan, and then I would have a slide on available sources, and then a slide on resources needed, or available resources and resources needed, which would also be budget. So you might say something like, instead of what is needed, you might say, budget. And then I'd also have a slide for timeline, because the timeline for this is 1 or 2 years. Yes, so you need to choose if you're doing 30,000 or 50,000, and if your plan is for 1 year or 2 years. So those are the decisions that you need to make. I haven't yet looked at your thing. So just a little bit more clarification, and like I said, I would rename this and join it, and then I would be more specific about the naming of that, project proposal, right? You just to be really specific. I read through your introduction, which I think is good, but there's some things you want to spend, and here it looked like you were doing history and introduction as 2 different slides, but here you've got introduction, history, and then you go into goals, which is also not on your table of contents. So this might be like project objectives, but this is what you want after your introduction, but it should, in terms of how you're managing the expectations of your reader/viewer in the TOC, the table of contents, is not exactly lining up. But I read the introduction, history, and it's the best one I've read so far. My initial response to it is it needs evidence. So all of your slides, with the exception of like the first 2, the cover slide and the table of contents, they all need evidence integrated into them. So you say black-footed ferrets are currently on the endangered species list. The ferrets failed to thrive due to failed to, is it failed or fail? I'm a little confused about that verb tense there. Due to an exotic disease known as a sylvatic plague that affects, I wouldn't call it exotic, I would just call it non-native. It's a non-native disease, so it's not native to the range in which the black-footed ferrets have existed. And not using exotic is really a what we call a post-colonial choice. But that affects much of the ferret's primary food source, prairie dogs. Do ferrets eat prairie dogs? I read something about prairie dogs, but I don't remember. I thought for some reason ferrets were vegetarian. Human intervention also plays a big role. You can always have a better word than big. Plays a critical role in the decreasing populations of ferrets. Always make sure you're focused on black-footed ferrets. Humans consider prairie dogs pests and a hazard to cattle, and often resort to poisoning, not poisoning, and hunting them, which breaks up large populations of prairie dogs. And then you want to remind the reader what the connection is between prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets. So evidence is needed throughout there, and especially information about, I'm trying to look down here. I don't recall if you, I don't think you'd have that I recall at the top of my head. It might be, I might be missing it. And then you go on to talk about the range, the historic range, right? So I'm going to talk about the whole introduction in just a second. Through the United States, you want that capitalized, and into Mexico, and then in the 1970s side, yes, the black-footed ferret was declared extinct. You need evidence for that. 2 years later, a small population of 18 ferrets was found in Métis, I don't know how to say that, in Wyoming. These ferrets were captured and brought back the species, helped the species come back from extinction, maybe, I think is how you want to word that, through breeding programs and efforts to vaccinate the ferrets from the sylvatic plague. The population has started to grow. So it's all information, but it's missing evidence and it's missing specificity. So I just initially did some research on the black-footed ferret. So I looked first at the categories and criteria of the endangered species list, right? So they are here, I believe. I tried to look for confirmation of that, but I'm pretty sure, because I think there's around like just over 300 in the wild, if I'm remembering that correctly. So they would fall into this, right? I think so. Not here. So they're not critically endangered, because that's less than 250 mature adults. And that's not that. It's less than 500. So they're endangered. They're not critically endangered. They're not extinct in the wild. But they're not vulnerable, they're not near threatened, and they're not least concern, right? So this is that endangered species list where you can, okay, they're here, but maybe we won't want to bring them up to here or get them off the list altogether. I read through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I don't know if this is a source you came across with, because I haven't yet looked at your references page. But they have a lot of information on the black-footed ferret. And this was especially interesting, this black-footed ferret draft recovery plan. It's long. It's like 130 pages, I think. But obviously you don't have to read it all. I didn't. It has wonderful images from the 60s or 70s. But so what happened is in 2013, they took this previous document that was about, and this is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they updated it, and they added to it, and they revised it to kind of talk about what their objectives are. So it's almost like exactly what you're doing, but in a much more elaborate way because this is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So, like if we just look at, and I think here's where I found the information. Right, they say it was listed as endangered in 1967, pursuant to the Early Endangered Species legislation, and it was grandfathered into the Endangered Species Act of 73. And like I said, this is from 2013. We estimate the average number of breeding adult ferrets is approximately 364. They've got data that shows that. And they give more numbers about adults and where they're located, and the species remains vulnerable to several threats, including that sylvatic plague, that non-native disease, and inadequate regulatory mechanisms, which is really human-based things. So then they talk about the habitat requirements and the limiting factors, and this is where they bring up they depend on the prairie dogs for food and on their burrows for shelter. The historical range of the ferret coincided with the ranges of the black-tailed prairie dog and the white-tailed prairie dog, and so the ferret's close association with the prairie dogs was an important factor in the ferret's decline. And that's because, and then they go on to talk about how the prairie dog occupied habitat and prairie dog numbers were dramatically reduced by temporal and permanent habitat loss. And as a result of that, right, the parrots, sorry, I have parrots, parrot and ferret rhyme. The ferret population declined simultaneously with the prairie dogs, right, which is something you guys are already addressing. And then they talk about these recovery strategies, and then they have recovery goals. And it's just interesting to look at how they're doing it, because you might want to model what you're doing, and you're already doing some of these things, but they, like I said, they just do it on a more verbose, detailed level. So they talked about, they partnered with the Black-Footed Ferret Recovery Implementation Team, and then they say recovery will be achieved by establishing a number of ferret populations where appropriate habitat exists, and by ameliorating or making better threats impacting the species so as to follow the ferret's persistence. Although ferret habitat has been dramatically reduced from historical times, a sufficient amount remains if its quality and configuration is appropriately managed. And then they talk about how the management of that land would be conducted by traditional state, tribal, and federal fish and wildlife and land management agencies, and then roping in private parties, so those landowners, conservation organizations, and continuing to garner their support for the ferret recovery. And then they go into this. These are our goals ultimately for the ferret. It's quite extensive, but it goes through a lot. Like I said, I don't know if you've seen this or not. It's hard to highlight PDFs. But the goal of the plan is to recover the black-footed ferret such that it no longer meets the Endangered Species Act's definition of endangered or threatened, and can be removed, or what they call delisted, from the federal list of endangered and threatened wildlife. And then they talk about their recovery objectives. What it will depend on. So the continued efforts of captive breeding facilities, so having those areas where they can breed black-footed ferrets to provide animals of suitable quality and quantity for release into the wild, the conservation of the prairie dog habitat, which they already kind of addressed, and then the management of the sylvatic plague to minimize impacts to ferrets. So those are the three main recovery objectives to delisting this species from the ESA list. And the downlisting criteria is interesting. And then they have the delisting criteria as well. So, and they say the recovery criteria, and the criteria is how they assess it, right? So the recovery plan revision provides reasonable biological and logistically achievable criteria that may be used to realize downlisting and delisting objectives in particular. And so downlisting is where people get moved, species, I mean, we're a species, but you know what I mean. Species gets put into different categories on the ESA's list, and then delisted means you're completely delisted, you're completely off the list. So then they've got the downlisting criteria, and then they've got the delisting criteria. So it's a ambitious plan to not just downlist, but to delist. So you might be specific about which one you're doing, or if you're doing both. And then they give very specific information, like how much land they need, and they're always going back to legislation, like delisting criteria are new since the 1988 recovery plan, and in order to be delisted, a species has to meet this recovery criteria, and then they go on to talk about that, and then they go on and go on and go on and give a lot of information that I don't think I would have the time to patience to do, but it's important that people are doing this type of work. But to go back to your introduction and history, what you want to focus on here is I might either split up like you have in your table of contents, like do an introduction and then do a history, or choose to combine them and then make that, and then have that reflected on your table of contents. But your introduction should really be, here's the issue, right, which you talk about the issue of black-footed ferrets and what has been problematic in their sustainability or their not being able to easily downlist or delist from the ESA's list. So, but then you want to talk about your you want to bring in your client in the introduction as well. So, based on, and your client is here. I think this is your client, right? The Defenders of Wildlife. So you would want to bring them up in your introduction. So you would want to say, like, here's the problem. The problem is the endangered level of this species. The Defenders of Wildlife is this type of, is a nonprofit organization. It's been around since this year. This is what they've done, with this grant-funded opportunity. The Defenders of Wildlife will be able to do X, Y, and Z and make sure that those proposals, because that would be the actual proposal, are aligned with the National Geographic's RFP. So that's why I'm saying you might want to split up the history and the introduction. But if you do split that up, which I kind of would, I would do just an introduction where you have an introduction to the problem that's supported by evidence, bringing in your client, explaining briefly who they are and how they would, how they and National Geographic would benefit from this grant-funded opportunity for this particular, with this particular client, and then have a brief, I don't know if I'd even call it history, but you might even say like history and the client, right? And then, or histories or history of the black-footed ferret and the client. And then what I might do is then give some information about what the black-footed ferret endangered species looks like kind of this information that you have here, and then also here's some additional information about the client, like what has the client accomplished, why would they be good, why are they a good candidate to receive this money from National Geographic, right? So if you do a history slide, I might encompass both of those things in there. So then you go into goals, and which I think is good. Work with our client, Defenders of Wildlife, to return a colony to Nebraska's western prairie lands. So my initial question as National Geographic would be, do black-footed ferrets currently exist in Nebraska? I don't know. I read a lot of stuff about black-footed ferrets, but I didn't read everything. So I need more information about what that species looks like. If I go back to here, you talk about their historic range that extended from Canada through the United States and into Mexico. That's a big giant swath of land that could easily go through the entire United States. So you want to be a little bit more specific about what you mean by, why you're choosing Nebraska. Sorry, I was just trying to remember what some of the previous research has said to me about locations, but here we need evidence about why you're choosing Nebraska, what's the swath of land or how much land is available there, is it protected, is it going to have the necessary prairie dogs and other types of things that black-footed ferrets would need for a sustained survival and what's the verb I'm looking for? Building up the population of this species. And then you focus on education, and then the dealing with the sylvatic plague issue, and then getting local governments involved to place hunting limits on prairie dog populations. I would bet money or something that there's already limitations on hunting ferrets, black-footed ferrets. There's gotta be laws in place, whether they're federal laws and or state laws, that make it very illegal to hunt and kill endangered species. I don't know if the prairie dog is endangered, but if so, or if not, if the black-footed ferret is endangered, you definitely can't kill a black-footed ferret. If the prairie dog is not endangered, then you're right that hunting limits should be, and not just hunting limits, I would say fines. I think you would want to get really dead serious and aggressive. If you're really serious about, I don't think the World Wildlife Foundation or National Geographic is going to be yeah, we'll put hunting limits. I don't know how many people hunt. I don't think they hunt prairie dogs. I think they're get off my yard. I don't think they eat them. Maybe they do. I don't know. But I think it's more, is the prairie dog on the endangered species list at all? If they are, there should be some law already in place that protects them. And if they're not, it's about putting legislation into place that will allow Nebraska to, if that legislation were passed, to limit killing prairie dogs. I wouldn't just say hunt, I would just say killing, because there's a variety of ways you could do away with something. If that legislation were to take place, right, that would be in the form of maybe extreme fines, perhaps jail time. It just depends on how serious you want it to be. And that's becoming more popular. So, and I spent many years in Florida where if somebody killed a endangered turtle, it was all over the news, and that person was going to jail. So it's, they take that stuff very, very seriously in a lot of states. So a lot of times you don't want to play around with endangered species when it comes to killing them, because there are extreme legal punishments for that. And you might want to look at what some of those punishments are in order to establish your own, like what that looks like. You can look and see what, if somebody were to kill an animal on the endangered species list, like what are they state, is it state legislation or federal legislation? And then what does that look like? Is it a fine? Is it jail? Is it, how big is the fine? Does it depend on the animal? Does it depend on how endangered they are, or how, that type of thing. The education part, I think, is good. I think the more beneficial thing, I think not only educating, but, and this is just from reading that document, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife document that I was reading, I think it's not just going to be educating Nebraska farmers, but I think it's going to be getting them on your side. So maybe having them sign a contract or something along those lines that makes it an actual legal thing, where you're not only involving the local government, but you're involving the private citizens and the people who own these lands to help protect them. And maybe they sign some type of document that say that they will, not put out poisoning, not do this, not do that to the land, because, they can make all the promises they want, and if you don't have it in a contract and they break that, verbal contract, then you don't have any ways to kind of punish them, and then they could be detrimental to the cultivation of the species. So that's why I'm saying you might just want to rethink the education part of this. I think this is good. I don't think is there not, and this is, I just go back to the question. And then the first bullet point is why. Would they naturally exist there? Is it part of like that historic range? Or is it, like, I know like South Dakota and North Dakota and Wyoming, I think like those areas, I feel like Nebraska would be on that list, but is it because, so I think just more unpacking here, just more specificity is needed. Like, why is there no, where do the current populations exist? I can't remember off the top of my head. And why Nebraska? Why not continue the work that is being done in the place where black-footed ferrets are, seem to be thriving, and where they have maybe some of those facilities that are used for breeding? Why are you looking to set up a whole new station in a whole new state? So that's a big begging the question. And then you have reduced large colonies of prairie dog populations on Nebraska farmlands, causing loss of the ferret's main food source and habitat. A little bit more information is needed there. So we want more, again, that more information about the prairie dog, because the relational dynamic between the prairie dog and the black-footed ferret seem to be kind of the same. So we just want more information about what do prairie dog populations. So this says to me that prairie dogs exist in Nebraska, even though their colonies are being reduced. due to, and then that results in the ferret's declination. Sylvatic plague, farmers poisoning and hunting prairie dogs on their land. Where is this happening and how? Are they doing it unintentionally to ferrets by way of prairie dogs? Is that what's happening? And then again, I would double check. I'm guessing, I'm just guessing, I don't know, that the prairie dog is not endangered. And so because of that, there is no legislation that makes it illegal to kill prairie dogs. But, and this is a really good point, if this is what the point you're making, because of that intrinsic ecosystem tie between the prairie dog and the black-footed ferret, there should be legislation regulating the prairie dog, regulating the killing of prairie dogs, whether it's poisoning or hunting or just kicking it in the face. I don't know. So then you go into education. I at first thought this was a picture of a birthday party because of this triangle. So, it's a fine picture. It's a little smushed, but so the education plan is print products throughout the state of Nebraska where there is a chance that a black-footed ferret colony could survive. My initial thought is, are farmers going to care about a printed brochure and flyer? So I'm wondering if there's more you can't do in terms of education, and that's where you would get into maybe creating some type of, in conjunction with the local governments and small governments, if you go with Nebraska, if you're going with a new state, creating some type of city council or some type of council that has farmers and anyone else who wants to join from the area that meet regularly, just like, neighborhood councils or city councils or whatever they're called, meet specifically to address the survival of the black-footed ferret and what everybody is doing. So I feel like the education part needs to be more persuasive, because I feel like this is an education that's just awareness, and an awareness is kind of like that idea of running a marathon. It's like, we're running a marathon for cancer, but it's like you're not doing anything else. It's like, what else is happening? So it's the concept of raising awareness has come under a lot of scrutiny in terms of what it actually does for the cause. Awareness is only so effective to a point. And then you go on to education. I liked this part better because this is where you go into more of the ideas that I was thinking of, where you have these town hall meetings where you rope people in to keep them in the loop. But I think having a more formalized version of that, where a committee is created that includes local government and farmers and any type of people who have some type of leadership position or relevant position to the survival of the black-footed ferret on this committee, and then the committee would hold town hall meetings at local venues. That I think would be a more formalized version of that would be, I think, a more effective way of treating this. Then you have the vaccination plan, which is, yes, obviously it needs addressed. And you say this is through baiting, which causes minimal harm to non-target species. I think more information is needed for that. Colony birth, I'm just want to see where you've got equipment and materials, personnel. And then you go into research questions. Research questions should be moved way up by the introduction. Timeline, and then you have your end goals. So just, I don't know if you saw this, I did come across on the World Wildlife Foundations that they've been testing drones to help with the black-footed ferrets population. And so one of the ways that they've been doing this is, I believe, after reading through this, as a way to combat the sylvatic plague, is that, and this is through the U.S. Geological Survey, National Wildlife Health Center, and the University of Wisconsin. They developed an oral vaccine to prevent prairie dogs from the plague, and they first tested this in a lab setting, and then they began field trials in 2012, and they've manually distributed vaccine baits by hand on 50-acre test plots, and results were optimistic. And so then what they've been doing is they have been using drones to drop, I believe, these peanut butter treats that have the vaccine in it, where the prairie dogs would eat it up. And they talk about how they've used the drones as well as ATVs, and they drop it at different intervals, and then they kind of talk about their results, and of course additional work is needed. But this is something you can also do, like maybe your vaccination plans include continuing this drone delivery of vaccinations against the sylvatic plague. That could be part of your vaccination plan, because sorry, I first thought you were saying that you're going to administer the plague to the local prairie dog, and I was like, no, you don't want to give them the plague. Because right now baiting is a little bit non-specific, so it's just a recommendation for that. Colony birth, coordinate with the Defenders of Wildlife to find suitable location for colony birth in Nebraska. So this is again where you might look at what has been done, and I can't remember if it's South Dakota, but where they have the facilities where they are breeding quote-unquote quality black-footed ferrets. I hate to use that phrase, but that's kind of what they're saying. And then releasing them into the wild. You might look at what has been done successfully there and talk about translating that to Nebraska. So then this might have more information. So by using the models from the South Dakota, I don't know what state it was, the South Dakota facilities where they bred and did this, we will coordinate with DOW to replicate that breeding process to not only find a location for a colony, but to breed ferrets and then eventually release them into the wild. And then altogether, like, how many ferrets do you, like, what does that look like? Like, how many ferrets has that breeding facility eventually released into the wild? And then you would use those numbers to determine, like, what that would look like in Nebraska. And then equipment and materials. So you have equipment and materials, personnel. So this is where you want to get into budget. What I would do is I would have, before equipment and materials, I would have available resources. And I would list, because you guys have very little money with which you're dealing, I would list all of you and give yourselves fake credentials. And as the people who already work with the Defenders of Wildlife, like, I'm the director of the Defender of Wildlife, and I have a PhD in zoology. I have no idea, right? Or veterinary science or conservation. I don't even know if that's a degree. But I would say every one of you wants to give fake credentials. You already work for the Defenders of Wildlife. You don't need to hire anybody. You guys are able to do this yourselves. Maybe you will work for the University of Nebraska. I don't know. And you're partnering with the Defenders of Wildlife. So it all just depends on how you want to position yourselves. Like maybe you're professors and you have research interests in black-footed ferrets, and you want to ultimately partner with the Defenders of Wildlife to bring about and cultivate a population of black-footed ferrets in Nebraska. So first I would have available resources, include all your stuff on there. You don't have the money to hire people. And then have a slide that is so then your personnel slide would go bye-bye. And then you would have a slide for materials or resources needed. And that's where you want to itemize, we need X, we need Y, we need Z, and you need to be very specific about it. Like you're starting to be specific about it, but there are no costs attached to any of these things. So in terms of that $30,000 or $50,000, the National Geographic needs to know how much are all these things going to cost. So how much does the vaccine bait form of sylvatic plague cost, right? What does animal tagging and tracking systems cost? I feel like a lot. I don't know. But maybe some of these things, if you work for a university, maybe you already have them. Maybe the Defenders of Wildlife already have them, right? So it just depends on what is already available to you versus what you need to procure with that grant-funded money, and you need to be very specific about what it is you would be buying with that money. And then I talked about that. I talked about moving your research questions up. You've got a timeline. It's good. It looks like you guys are already putting yourself on here, which is good. So you're already thinking about you're doing the work, and it looks like it just needs a little bit of extra filling in. And I think I would focus it on, because you have 1 or 2 years to do it, I might be specific about how long you plan on taking. And I think, if I remember correctly, though I could be confusing it with another CFP because I've read a few of them now. I think it's from another one that I saw. I thought it said start in August, but like I said, that could be. Like the deadlines for the RFP are October 19th and April of 2020. So having things starting in June of, does that say 2020? That's a good idea. I would keep that. So you're already thinking ahead, which is good. But I would just be specific about, like, it looks like you're doing this for, you start in June 2020 and you're going through August of 2020. You could stretch that out for a year at least and go through June of 2021, and then flesh this all out a little bit more, since you would have a little bit more time. End goal and results. The removal, so the delisting, I think, is your end result. And again, I would bring more information, like from that document I showed you, that talks about what is the criteria for delisting, and then expected results to have the future of the new colony secured. Do you mean in Nebraska? This will help gain another colony and state added to the Fish and Wildlife Service's goal of 3,000 breeding adults and more than 30 or more wild populations across 9 of the 12 original range states. Good. Increased life expectancy and survival rates in ferrets and prairie dogs exposed to sylvatic plague. And I think what you're missing here is legislation, because you talk about local farmers and populations, but you're forgetting a key part of this, which is implementing legislation. So you probably want to add that to it. Okay, I feel like I have talked a lot about the black-footed ferret. Probably not as much as you guys. But if you have any questions about it, I could talk about these forever, so I have to cut myself short. Probably not short, this is probably a lengthy video. But if you have any questions about anything I've said in the video, or if you want further clarification of anything I've stated in the video, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll also be, of course, checking in on the group's discussion forum to see how conversation is going during Module 9. Otherwise, I will be talking to you guys soon. Okay? Bye-bye.